You're strapped into a cockpit that's a flying bomb. The fuel behind you is so corrosive it'll eat through your bones. You've got 7 minutes of power before you're gliding a 4,000-pound brick back to Earth. And your landing gear? A metal skid. This was Tuesday morning for German pilots in 1944. But here's the thing. This death trap was faster than jets that wouldn't exist for another decade. It should have won the war. Instead, it killed more German pilots than Allied guns ever did. What you've just heard was Nazi Germany's final roll of the dice. Aircraft so advanced they were decades ahead of their time, and so dangerous they became flying coffins. Today, we're looking at 5 machines that pushed aviation beyond the edge of insanity. Hit that like button and subscribe, because what you're about to hear will blow your mind. World War II was the most violent technological arms race in the history of humanity. Aviation advanced by decades in 6 years. Jets shrieked across the sky, and rockets delivered death from hundreds of miles away. Bombers grew so big they could block the sun. But nowhere was this technological hysteria more frantic than in Nazi Germany. By 1943, the war was slipping away. Allied bombers were burning German cities to the ground every night. The Luftwaffe was losing pilots faster than they could be trained. So German engineers did what desperate people do. They threw logic out the window and reached for miracles. The result? Planes that belonged in science fiction, not World War II. Rocket fuel-driven airplanes that melted human flesh. Jets so accelerated they needed teenage pilots because trained adults were dead. Bombers that burned more often than they bombed. These weren't just test planes. They were symptoms of a nation that confused brilliance with madness. From rocket interceptors that flew like bullets but lasted like candles, to wooden jets flown by children, these are 5 times when World War II aircraft tech went way too far. Let's start with the ultimate too much too fast machine, the Messerschmitt ME 163 Comet. You're 22 years old. You're at a German airfield in 1944. Allied bombers drone overhead. Your commander leads you to what looks like a stubby bullet with wings. "This is your new fighter," he says. You climb in and think, this isn't an airplane. This is a controlled explosion with a cockpit. The moment that rocket launched, you were the fastest man alive, 0 to 30,000 feet in under 4 minutes. Allied fighters struggled to ascend, but you shot past them like they were standing still. The G-forces forced you back into your seat, blinding you. But then there was the catch. 7 minutes, that's all the fuel you had. 7 minutes to climb, hunt, attack, and pray you could glide back alive. No second chances, no extra tanks. After those 7 minutes, you were flying a 4,000-pound glider with the aerodynamics of a brick. And the fuel? 2 chemicals, T-Stoff and C-Stoff. Harmless on their own, but together they created a thrust so ferocious it would blast you into space. If a single drop touched your skin, it didn't just burn. It dissolved flesh, muscle, and bone. Ground crews handled it like they were handling plutonium. Full protective suits, thick gloves, and prayers that they would not spill a drop. Despite that, mechanics died on the tarmac, burned alive by fuel leaking from perforated tanks. The Comet killed men just trying to fuel it. Landing was a game of Russian roulette. No wheels, just one skid. Come in too fast and the fuselage cracked like an eggshell. Too slow and you stalled and crashed. Hit a bump, fuel tanks ruptured, turning your cockpit into a chemical inferno. The cruel irony? The Comet was too fast for combat. Pilots had 3 seconds to line up on bombers before blazing past at 600 miles per hour, and most never fired a shot. In the entire war, Comets destroyed maybe 9 Allied aircraft. Meanwhile, hundreds of German pilots died flying them. The ME 163 was the fastest fighter of World War II. It was also proof that being first often means being dead. If the Comet was too complex for professionals, the Heinkel HE 162 was designed for amateurs. More precisely, 16-year-old amateurs. Nazi Germany's solution to running out of pilots? Provide jet fighters to teenagers. By the end of 1944, the Luftwaffe had exhausted its experienced flyers. Experienced pilots were dead across Europe. The survivors were shell-shocked wrecks. So the German planners had a brilliant idea. Create a jet so easy to fly that Hitler Youth members could do it. The HE 162 went from drawing board to prototype in 90 days. To put that into perspective, jets today take decades to develop. The result looked exactly like a rush job, an aviation Frankenstein monster. The jet engine sat atop like a tumor. Wings were made of plywood since Germany had exhausted its supply of aluminum. Cockpit controls were so rudimentary that they would have been at home on a bicycle. It was designed to be the Model T of fighters, cheap, mass-produced, deadly. During its first public demo attended by Nazi officials, the right wing tore off in flight. The prototype spiraled to the ground, killing the test pilot in front of a horrified crowd. That would have ended the program. Instead, it was just the beginning. Structural failures plagued all of them. Wooden components warped when it rained, changing aerodynamics in unpredictable ways. Engines overheated. Fuel systems leaked, filling cockpits with inflammable vapor. The cockpit canopy opened in flight, which at 500 miles per hour was a death sentence. On paper, the HE 162 could do 560 miles per hour, the same as top Allied fighters. But who was going to fly these things? Teenagers with a dozen hours of training and expected to become jet combat wizards overnight? The math was simple. Green pilots and temperamental aircraft add up to disaster. Most HE 162 losses weren't in combat. They were in training accidents and mechanical failures. Fewer than 300 reached combat units. The People's Fighter was supposed to save Germany through mass production. Instead, it became mass suicide with wings. Let's talk about what happens when engineers have unlimited budgets and unlimited ambition. The Arado AR 240 wasn't rushed like the HE 162 or powered by exotic chemicals like the Comet. It suffered from something far worse: perfectionism. The Luftwaffe wanted a heavy fighter that would do everything: escort bombers, intercept raiders, and bomb, conduct reconnaissance. The AR 240 was going to be the Swiss Army knife of war aviation. German designers took this task and ran headlong off a cliff. The AR 240 became a flying laboratory filled with every experimental technology in sight: pressurized cockpits, remote-controlled gun turrets, and elaborate cooling systems. Sophisticated navigation equipment, emergency smoke venting systems. On paper, beautiful. In the air, a disaster waiting to happen. The trouble with attempting to get one aircraft to do everything is that you end up with an aircraft that does nothing well. All those systems were making the AR 240 overweight, unstable, and mechanically complex to an absurd extent. Test pilots claimed flying it was like balancing on the edge of a knife while juggling burning torches. The remote gun turrets jammed incessantly. Pressurization systems leaked, and pilots fainted at altitude. Complex cooling systems overheated, as if irony was standard equipment. Emergency systems failed so consistently that pilots joked they needed backup emergency systems. But the real killer was aerodynamic instability. The AR 240 required constant pilot input to fly straight. Add the weight of all those systems, and you had an aircraft that could spin out of control from a strong crosswind. Test pilots risked death each time they flew. Most never returned. Those who did land intact would often not fly again. The message spread. The AR 240 was a death trap disguised as a technological marvel. Few were completed before the program quietly died. Millions of marks, thousands of hours of engineering, dozens of test pilots, all wasted in demonstrating that trying to do everything means accomplishing nothing. If the AR-240 died from over-engineering, the Messerschmitt ME 210 was killed by arrogance. This is how one of Germany's most respected manufacturers created a plane so dangerous that pilots preferred facing Allied fighters to flying their equipment. The Luftwaffe needed a replacement for the aging Bf-110 heavy fighter. Messerschmitt, riding high on Bf-109's success, promised a game-changer. They were so confident they initiated mass production before flight testing was even complete. That decision is one of the worst mistakes in aviation history. From its first test flight, the ME-210 performed deadly. Without warning, it would pitch nose down, savagely hurling pilots toward the ground. It stalled unpredictably when turning. During dives, vibrations could tear wings right off. Landing and takeoff were worse. The aircraft would ground loop, spin out of control on the runway with no warning. A lot of pilots didn't make it through their first landing. Those who did walked away and requested to be sent elsewhere, preferring combat duty to test flying. But that is not the most ridiculous part. Messerschmitt had already geared up for mass production. Hundreds of ME-210s rolled off production lines before anyone admitted the plane was inherently unflyable. The Luftwaffe was left with squadrons of fighters more dangerous to their pilots than the enemy. Desperate to salvage their investment, engineers tried everything, lengthening the fuselage and redesigning wings, installing bigger engines and adding control surfaces. Eventually, they changed so much that they renamed it the ME-410 and hoped it would pass as another airplane. Damage was done, however. The ME-210's reputation was so toxic that veteran pilots cursed the sight of it. Even the redesigned ME-410s never shook off its predecessor's shadow. The ME-210 squandered resources Germany could ill afford: pilots, material, factory space, and time. In a war where every month mattered, Messerschmitt's arrogance handed the Allies a giant advantage. The lesson was learned too late. Reputation matters, testing matters, and pride goeth before a fall, especially at 300 miles per hour. Finally, the Heinkel HE 177 Greif, Germany's only heavy bomber and possibly the most cursed aircraft ever built. This is what happens when political demands override engineering reality, creating a machine that becomes its own worst enemy. Germany needed a strategic bomber to reach distant targets with massive payloads. The HE 177 should have been their B-17. Instead, it became known as the Flaming Coffin. The curse began with Hitler himself. Not content with a heavy bomber, he demanded that this giant four-engine aircraft also dive bomb. Yes, a 30-ton strategic bomber that was expected to dive like a small Stuka. Engineers said that this was impossible. Physics said this was impossible. Reality said this was impossible. Hitler did not care. Compelled to attempt the impossible, designers mated four engines in two massive power systems, each driving one propeller. This reduced dive bombing stress, but created problems that plagued the aircraft forever. Paired engines overheated constantly, too tightly grouped. Single-engine cooling systems couldn't handle two engines under a single cowling. Oil leaks became fuel leaks, became fires, became explosions. Crews called it the Flaming Coffin and joked it had more ways to catch fire than fly straight. One pilot recalled, "When you saw an HE 177 overhead, you didn't need a compass to follow it. Just follow the smoke trail and listen for explosions." Ground crews had complex fire drills because fires weren't emergencies, they were routine. Some bases stationed fire trucks at the ends of runways specifically for HE 177 operations. In combat, the HE 177 was worse than useless. It was counterproductive. Many caught fire before takeoff. Those that got airborne often returned as flying torches. Some missions were scrubbed because more bombers caught fire during taxi than reached targets. The tragic irony: when HE-177s came back from missions without exploding, they were excellent bombers. Good design, excellent payload, excellent range. But none of that mattered when your airplane was more likely to destroy itself than the enemy. Over 1,000 were built. Almost none of them had any impact on the war effort. They sucked enormous resources while producing virtually nothing. The HE-177 wasn't just a defective aircraft. It was the perfect example of how unrealistic political pressures were able to turn genius into disaster. 5 planes that might have changed World War II. 5 planes that provided bitter lessons about innovation and desperation. The ME-163 Comet, faster than anything in the skies, but only for 7 minutes. The HE-162 Volksjäger, a jet constructed for teenagers who never lived to see adulthood. The AR-240, designed for instability. The ME-210, so dangerous that pilots risked enemy fire. The HE-177 Greif caught fire more often than it dropped bombs. These were not engineering failures. They were symptoms of a nation that had confused technological progress with practical solutions. They were cutting edge. They pushed the envelope, but they were rushed, unstable, and lethally flawed. The Luftwaffe believed it could innovate its way out of defeat. Instead, these airplanes accelerated that defeat by consuming resources, killing pilots, and wasting time on solutions that caused more problems than they cured. The lesson? Advanced technology isn't always better technology. Desperation breeds reckless innovation. Sometimes the pursuit of the perfect weapon creates the perfect disaster. These 5 aircraft were aviation's future, arriving too early in desperate hands. They remind us that the line between genius and madness isn't just thin. Sometimes it's invisible. If this journey kept you entertained, strike that like button, subscribe for more incredible history, and ring that notification bell. Were these planes revolutionary technology or proof that desperation causes genius to implode into catastrophe? Sound off in the comments.